Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion for the online exhibition Shimmering Horizons. Thank you so much for being here to listen to the amazing artists from this project: Asinnajaq, Wes Harmon, Meagan Mizzou, Marina Roy, Tania, Willard, and Elizabeth Zvonar. My name is Laurie White, and I'm the curator of this exhibition, which is a collaboration between the Orr Gallery in Vancouver, where I work, and the Canada Gallery at Canada House in London, in the UK. Shimmering Horizons is an exhibition that puts the idea of shimmer, a concept described by writer and anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose as the aesthetic experience of ecological complexity and ancestral power, into productive alignment with the image of the horizon, a potent metaphor for the future. In this exhibition, horizons shimmer both literally and figuratively. The glimmer of stars and the aurora borealis make palpable the potency of ancestral and ecological inheritance, the future enfolded by the past. So although we're meeting in virtual space today, we're still, of course, all living in physical spaces and on particular lands and territories. So I'd like to acknowledge that the Orr Gallery operates principally in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I myself have been an uninvited guest here on these lands since 2016, and I'm extremely privileged to be able to live and work here. As an immigrant to Canada from the UK, I have directly benefited from the entwined colonial histories of these two places. And as such, it's also my responsibility to challenge, question, and unsettle this privilege in my work and my daily life. So it's been really exciting to be able to make international connections through this project and to share the thoughtful and critical practices of the artists in this exhibition. So before I introduce our participants properly, the Acting High Commissioner of Canada in the UK, Stephanie Beck, is going to say a few words of welcome in a short clip.
Thank you, Laurie. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are today. My name is Stephanie Beck, and I'm the Acting High Commissioner for Canada in the United Kingdom. Il me fait un grand plaisir de me joindre à vous aujourd'hui. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this virtual panel discussion that is part of the programming associated with the online exhibition, Shimmering Horizons. If you have already visited the virtual exhibition, which I hope you all have, you may have read in the introduction that this project is a partnership with the Orr Gallery in Vancouver. It was scheduled to open last fall here at Canada House in London. The COVID-19 pandemic has made us adjust to the current circumstances by turning a considerable amount of our programming into digital versions, and this includes all of the cultural programming that we normally support, now branded as #CanadaGoesDigital. For example, this panel should have been a lively exchange among the artists included in Shimmering Horizons and our guests in one of the beautiful spaces at Canada House on Trafalgar Square. But creativity always wins, and now we are able to share this discussion with audiences across Canada, the United Kingdom, and hopefully beyond. For the creative approach to the development of the online exhibition, I must thank, first of all, our partner, the Orr Gallery, and of course, the curator of the exhibition, Laurie White. But without the work and ideas of participating artists, we would not have had a panel discussion or an online exhibition. So our thanks also go to Elizabeth Zvonar, Marina Roy, Tania Willard, Wes Harman, who join us today from Vancouver and Chase in British Columbia, Asinnajaq, who is based in Montreal, and Meagan Musseau from Corner Brook in Newfoundland and Labrador. We can't help but notice that the entire creative team behind this exhibition is made up of creative women. Gender equality and empowering women across society is a top priority for the Government of Canada and all of us here at Canada House. It is for that reason that exactly a week ago, our High Commissioner in the United Kingdom, Janice Charette, hosted our signature event to celebrate International Women's Day. It had a similar format and included the participation of some remarkable women in their respective fields, from our guest of honor, our Minister for International Development, Karina Gould, to our literary giant, Margaret Atwood, among other speakers. Today's panel discussion, which I'm sure will be just as rich and insightful as that one was, will focus on the various visions of the future that the participating artists explore through their work, drawing from creative science fiction and feminist perspectives, and framed by current ecological and political realities. Like you, I'm looking forward to their discussion and learning what role art and the voice of women may have in shaping more equitable, ecological, and social futures, a theme that is of particular relevance in the challenging times we currently live in. Before I go, I would encourage you to keep in touch with us through our various social media channels where you can learn about how we support Canadian culture. Thank you again to all the artists and to you, Laurie. I hope our paths cross again virtually or, even better, in person.
Thank you very much to Stephanie for that warm introduction from Canada House. And I'd like to just take a moment to express my heartfelt thanks to Gabriel Araujo, Kyla Donati, and the rest of the team at the Canada Gallery for all their guidance and support in making this project happen. And I'd also just like to build a little bit on what Stephanie said there about this panel being coordinated in relation to the celebrations for International Women's Day, and just say that this is also an opportunity to celebrate the contributions of non-binary, two-spirit, and gender diverse folks to the rich cultural landscape in Canada and to this exhibition in particular. So we're going to talk for about an hour and a half today, starting with some introductions to each of the artists' works in the exhibition, and then followed by some discussion about the topic of futurity. And we will have some time for audience questions at the end as well. So if you do have a question or a comment, please feel free to post that in the chat in the little box that's just below this screen, and we'll be really happy to answer those at the end. Okay, so I would like to welcome each of our panelists to the floor, and to help with that, I have some brief clips that I would like to share that are taken from the interview videos that you can find on the Shimmering Horizons site. First of all, Tania Willard. Tania is an artist, curator, writer based in Chase, BC, the territory of the Secwepemc people. Tania is of Secwepemc and settler ancestry, and her work often addresses bodies of knowledge and skills that are conceptually linked to her interest in intersections between Aboriginal and other cultures. So let's just take a look at the little clip for Tania.
So the work in this Canada House exhibition is called Gut Instincts, and it references photographs of what is called material culture from an anthropologist language, but what we call ancestor artwork. And so it's an image of a cedar root basket, a really beautiful cedar root basket in a rectilinear form. And imbricated on that basket is a design which was recorded by an anthropologist as referencing a entrails design, it was called. And I was quite intrigued by this design, having lived more rurally, and my dad is a hunter, taught by his grandfather, my great-grandfather, and the importance of the reciprocity of that relationship when you harvest an animal. And that even the entrails, the viscera, those are taken in and recycled by the crawlers, by those that scavenge carcass, and then we take that meat and survive as our families for the winter. I was interested in the archive, interested in this provocation of this entrails design, and the idea of intuition. So the idea of intuiting your way around an archive, which is sort of like the exact opposite of a historical approach. But it is the approach that I have used in several instances of both curating and researching archives, particularly of Indigenous materials. That I'm sensitive to the way that, as my friend says, I talk about it as intuition, but he says it's your ancestors talking to you. And so I also acknowledge that there's a process involved there that is, it's not clear cut, and it is in a kind of an intuitive way of approaching the material. And so this idea of entrails, of viscera, of guts as gut instincts was a parallel that I was drawing. And so I worked with an image of one of the baskets, this one that in particular Livingston Farrand talks about as an entrails design. And I replicated that in the artwork in the exhibition, and also used a lot of hot and pop kind of colors to reference the ways in which Indigenous material culture, ancestor artwork is, found itself largely in museum collections and largely attributed as an ethnographic or anthropological reference, whereas I'm trying to see it with an aesthetic reference, with what is the visual language here. And to me, our land claims are inherently part of this idea of harvest from the land, and our intuition is a kind of a connection to the land and ancestors. And so all of that is sort of read in and contained by this basket, contained by this cedar root basket, which is makes up these kind of columns in the artwork. And so the futurity of gut instincts is to continue to be emplaced, to be part of my land, and to teach my children that, and to know that those artworks, those knowledges of our ancestors expressed in something like the cedar root basket are part of the future as well. And they are weaving it. That basket is weaving the past, the present, and the future to a shimmering, glittering, futurity that I can't see today, but that maybe my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren can see. And so I want to make it colorful for them.
Awesome. So Tania, I just had a follow-up question for you right off the bat. You mentioned how when you make work on your land, you think of it as a land claim, and you actually have some land under the kind of title Bush Gallery, where you have residencies and workshops, and you make work as well. But I was wondering, when you make work and show it in other places, Vancouver, across Canada, internationally, online even, how that relationship still exists of kind of referring back to place and referring back to your territory, or whether it's even really necessary for it to have that connection. Just like, what is that relationship?
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. Thanks to everyone for supporting the exhibition and this talk today. Thank you to the other artists. It's such a pleasure to have my work shown alongside yours. Yeah, for the ways I think about that, I really think about the ways in which not only am I situated on my land, which has been a journey of sort of situating myself there, not only like based on all of the kind of colonial residue and ongoing colonial policy that displaces us from our lands, which is also about opportunity, which is also about where art circulates. It doesn't circulate in the same way on my reserve where I live. So also to clarify, I live on Nisconlith Indian Reserve. So I live within, the confines of the Indian Act within British Columbia and within Canada, which is directly a reference to our historical relationships with the UK. But I think of not only my situatedness on the land, but the ancestors who came before me and my, grandchildren who will come after me, that we all carry some part of that land within us. So, I can be away from my land and carry it within me. Importantly for me, I need to always address the confines of the Indian Reserve. Arthur Manuel, one of our Cookbee chiefs, who's passed on now, he talked about the kind of underlying reasons of Indigenous poverty, pointing to the 0.2% of Indian reserves in Canada. And so that is a present reality that my ancestors fought against, that my my current community fights for our land rights, and that's embedded for me in the work that we do and in conversations like this where we're adjacent to those structures of power. So for me, I carry that land with me, I situate myself on the land, and I engage relationally with others and the other lands that they carry with them. And I think thinking through that allows us to kind of consider that dialogical and relational way of being as a way maybe forward and a futurity that is beyond borders and beyond extraction, and positions us in a way where we can have more equality.
And just to clarify that point, 0.2% of the land in Canada is designated as reserves. So it's a minuscule amount, and yeah.
That's not, I mean, that's what is, defined for us by the Crown. Of course, we assert our, and part of my work has been asserting our, our not only ownership, but our relationship to our lands beyond that, beyond those confines.
Great, thanks so much, Tania. Up next, I would like to introduce Asinnajaq. Asinnajaq is a filmmaker, curator, and writer from Asinnajaq, Nunavik, based in Montreal. I'm going to say this wrong, but Jojage is the other name for it, Montreal. Her short film 3000 has won several awards and honors, including an award for Best Experimental Work at the 2017 Imaginative Film Festival. Asinnajaq is a member of the curatorial team for the Inuit Art Center at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, which we were just talking about how that opened already, and then the exhibition that Asinnajaq co-curated is opening later this month. So congratulations. And can we have the clip for Asinnajaq, please?
With 3000, I am wanted to make a piece that was with archives, that dealt with history as a way for myself to get to look through the archives and learn from them. Listening to the archives, it's actually like the subject is never the colonizer, it's always Inuit. And even when there are images with, like, you know, sailors, RCMP, whoever's there, teachers even, the story is, those are kind of peripheral figures. And so it's clearly not the focus of the archives. And probably a lot because of who the images are made of, which is another thing that you totally feel completely 100%. When you look at an image in the archives, at least I can like feel kind of why was this image made, who made it. You can feel all those things because of the gaze, how it's made, like the intention behind it. I think is like something you can feel so strongly. When you think about the future, usually you see dystopian futures, like almost 100% of the time. But I want to think about what would I want? What do I think, like in my wildest dreams, how could the future be? And I talk to my cousins and my family, and I just ask them, like, right now, in this moment, if you could live any way you wanted, how would you choose to live? And my cousins mostly said that what they want is they're living in Asinnajaq, my hometown, and what they want is to be able to live in camps like we used to live, or we never have actually, our generation, but we know that our ancestors did live that way. And most of my family loves going out camping and fishing and spending lots of time outside in the summertime. So I thought that's amazing, and I think that that's something that we can definitely do for ourselves, change the way that our system works for where we live, how much we can move around. So in the future, that's the biggest thing that I tried to dream about. And the other thing I thought about was like, what could we live in? From what I understand, you know, we always like to use technology smartly to help our lives improve. So I think I tried to imagine a way of like, how could we use green energy to use the tools that are maybe electronic that we want to. So I actually designed a whole house system with like food growing in the middle, and like, yeah, I like have drawings of it. And that's like the houses that Defiston made for the kind of last scene with people in it in the film. that's my like imagination. Where would I want to live with all this? Yeah, it like harnesses rainwater and like wind and all kinds of things. Yeah.
Great. So welcome, Asinnajaq. And to ask you a question about your piece, I think one of the things that's really fascinating for me about it is the way you use a lot of archival imagery that you took from your research in the National Film Board of Canada archives, and combined that with some footage that you had shot also with your father, who is a filmmaker as well, and then combined it with animation. So there's the kind of more figurative animation of the futuristic scenes at the end, but also animation throughout at the beginning. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you used animation to kind of hold these images together, and also maybe you sort of represent them or sort of refresh them and recontextualize them a little bit. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I really, when we had like the idea to do animation in the film, it immediately became a challenge to figure out how to make it feel integrated and like really a part of the work and not like something that would be tacked on at the end. So I think I spent a lot of time thinking about how it could really like be a part of the structure of the film and become integral and like not just be like tacked on at the end. So it was a really big challenge, and I'm really happy with what we came up with. And the animation really did, I think, become an important part of the story, where basically the whole story and the archives, I see them as coming out of so at the beginning it's like lichen, and you see the lichen forming with the like hypha, and they're coming together, and then it's becoming the lichen, and the lichen like kind of bursts into water, and then it's as if the whole story is coming out of the water, because water is life. And that's where the whole story is being held and coming from. So that's like part of how the animation became really important.
Yeah, and you use that kind of watery substance as like transition sequences between different groups of images. I think that's really effective as well. Amazing. Thanks so much. I'll come back to that later. I'd like to move on to introduce Marina Roy, who is an artist, writer, and professor at UBC based in Vancouver. And her artwork investigates the grotesque at the intersection of language and materiality. And her research interests include ecology, post-humanism, psychoanalysis, and biopolitics. In 2001, she published her first book, Sign After the X, and her newest book, Q Jumping, is to be published this spring, coming out soon, I hope. So let's just go to the clip from Marina, please.
Lately, my work has been focusing on issues around ecology and materials within the artwork. I'm interested in how, through thinking about the materials of painting or drawing, what can address certain issues. For instance, I've been working with bitumen and red iron oxide to deal with ideas around the origins of art, but also our kind of creative, destructive tendencies as human beings, and trying to integrate some of those materials, such as bitumen, as a way of addressing those issues. I was approached by Ingrid Koenig and Brandy Lee Cutler about making something around the issue of antimatter, and learned that matter and antimatter are something that is produced at with the Big Bang, And it created this energy that created the universe. And now we're in as humans, we haven't really been able to find very much antimatter anymore, but it is the kind of source of all energy in the universe. So I started thinking about this and how physicists have been trying to tap into creating antimatter in order to, as a new energy source. So I was thinking that this sounded quite hopeful, but at the same time quite apocalyptic. And I was thinking about, okay, so the old energy source of bitumen is still very much within our lives, but trying to envision what this kind of new energy might look like in the context of the universe. So I started just experimenting on wood panel, and through that process of experimentation, figured out a series of forms and the repeated motif of the worm, and these kind of explosive orbital forms and almost scientific like diagrams made into paintings that would address those issues. And so I'm again using bitumen and red iron oxide as some of the main color palette, but also some greens and yellows, and try to restrict the palette in order to create a kind of universe. So through making smaller experiments, kind of just kept experimenting and working on them until I came up with about, I think, 88 of them. I was looking at a lot of alchemical diagrams, and one of the diagrams that comes up a lot, I don't know, I think it's just post-medieval, it might be even 16th, 17th century, there are a lot of hands coming out of clouds, which are supposed to be kind of the hand of God, but I think of that, at that moment, also this kind of Cartesian motif of the human being the one that orders the universe, and this idea of, with the invention of perspective, suddenly the seat of perception is from the perspective of humans. I like to think of the worm as a really fertile symbol for maybe a way that we can think like worms more, and not so much as thinking of ourselves as higher beings.
Great. Hi, Marina. Thanks for joining us. I think something I wanted to ask you about in this work is there's like a really interesting tension between a sort of interest that you have obviously in science and scientific discoveries about the universe, and knowledge about the material universe, but then also a kind of maybe like a sense of foreboding about the environmental crisis that we're in, or like the Anthropocene, and that hand of God is also kind of like becomes like a symbol of the Anthropocene in some ways. So maybe there's like a sort of a push-pull around relationships to technology, and I wondered how this sort of ambivalent stance relates to caring for the environment or having like a concern for the environment, because I know that is something that's very much part of your sort of ethical and artistic practice. You're muted.
You'd think I'd know how to deal with that by now. I'm just on this 8 hours a day. Yeah, so the question is related to my relationship to technology, or what I think about?
It's kind of like that ambivalence.
Yeah. Well, when I made this series, I was in conversation with physicists as well as other artists who were trying to get their heads around what these doing at Triumph. I remember having a conversation with.
We just lost you for a little bit there. You were saying you were in conversation with physicists and artists?
Yeah, as part of the project at Triumph, the Leaning Out of Windows project that Ingrid and Randy Lee Cutler had organized, and the physicists talked about their work as being theoretical, experimental, but not really having a goal in mind. I found this quite suspect, not questioning where all of these funds were coming to them as if, you know, it was just on its own important work. And I was, you know, I was anticipating that this money was being put towards them because of the anticipation of this this discovery of antimatter and the ability to produce it as being a new energy form. And I think of it maybe, not that I know very much about it, but I think of it maybe on a par with how nuclear energy came about, and its destructive properties, as well as its ability to create you know, an energy source that would solve a lot of our problems in theory. But in my own life, I have the privilege of now having some land and learning to garden and being very interested in permaculture and figuring out how to create food and to create a better situation on the land where, you know, the forces of nature are, you know, like the mycelia, the hyphae are, you know, working in collaboration with other non-human life forms, and hopefully for humans as myself to learn to be better citizens with the land, and learning from non-human forms, if that makes sense. Being very attentive to the forces around me.
Yeah, I definitely read, like you mentioned, how the worm is this symbol for thinking more like worms or being more like worms. And I definitely read that symbol in this piece as a kind of little hopeful, sort of maybe like a little wedge in the otherwise very mixed and sometimes kind of contradicting imagery. So yeah, thank you for sharing that background about how you created that piece. Okay, so next person I would like to invite to the floor is Elizabeth Zvonar. Elizabeth is an artist living in Vancouver and has exhibited extensively in solo and group exhibitions across Canada and internationally. In 2016, she was inducted to the Royal Canadian Academy of the Arts and shortlisted for the IMEA Photography Prize at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And she is represented by Daniel Faria Gallery in Toronto. So can we have Elizabeth's clip, please?
Incorporates both collage and sculpture. And I'm interested in the metaphysical and how it may or may not manifest itself in this present reality. And I explore those ideas through some of the work that I do. I'm also very interested in art history and the trajectory that Western art history in particular has laid out for us, and interjecting a different perspective, a feminist perspective into that history. I spend a lot of time looking at things and trying to figure out what those relationships are. I'm most interested in popular culture imagery and things that are very pervasive in pop culture, and then taking it and playing around with it. And we're inundated with so much imagery out there that we become numb to it. And so to cherry pick things and then make something with it and then blow it up. Enlarging is a big part of how you can bring the obscure into something more focal, like a more focused image. I'm fascinated by outer space. When I was a kid, I was really interested in spaceships going into outer space, or NASA putting the Voyager, for example, up into outer space. And that's my one of my starting points for being interested in outer space, and then finding imagery every once in a while, some good pictures from the Hubble telescope, that kind of thing. I find them beautiful and very odd and fascinating all at once. So I like to use them in my work as well. I think they sort of summarize the mystery of what's out there.
Hi.
Hi, Elizabeth. So I just wanted to mention that little interview was shot in your back garden, and that was like a really fun little afternoon. So I wanted to ask you about, you draw from a really broad range of images, and you mentioned how you really like to use like pop culture imagery. So magazines, scientific magazines, fashion magazines, textbooks, art history textbooks, all kinds of different sources. So I was wondering a little bit like, a lot of artists are interested in the archive at the moment and engaging with archives, but to what extent you think about the sort of the public realm and those publications that you draw from as a kind of an archive, if at all.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and it's really great to be on this panel with everybody and in the show with everybody. Archives are, I think about them a little bit. There are people who think about them much more intently than I do, but I think of them in terms of storytelling, or if they're in a public or private record, the events of a life or a landscape or a geographic place. And some are based in fact, of course, and some are based in fiction. So I guess in terms of thinking about them in terms of the future, they could be cautionary tales or endless points of possibility, depending on how, if it's the glass is half full or half empty, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes maybe with and materials that end up in an archive, it's because somebody has decided that that's important and worth saving. Whereas you also draw from images that are kind of maybe throwaway, or like an ad in a magazine that might never be seen again, but it's still kind of like an imprint of its time. And then you sort of extract that and refresh it, or like put it into new combinations.
Recontextualize it, hopefully, or, have a subjective viewpoint about it. Yeah, I think collage in particular, one is always changing its context just by moving it around with other ideas.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so moving on to the next artist in this project, Meagan Mizzou. Meagan is a Mi'kmaq artist from Amalthagwek, Dahamcook, which is the Bay of Islands in Newfoundland. Meagan can correct me on that. And Meagan nourishes an interdisciplinary practice by working with customary art forms and new media, such as basketry, beadwork, land-based performance, video, and installation. So let's go to Meagan's clip.
So for the exhibition Shimmering Horizons, I'm including my basket series called Intergalactic Olnu Baskets. And these baskets are all made with synthetic materials such as vinyl tape, plastic, neon flagging tape. And around here on the top, just above the jikajij, is braided flagging tape. And normally we would use sweetgrass as a decorative element within the basket. But I wanted to push the conversation around access to resources, access to traditional and customary medicines, and the larger realities of what's happening within the environment. To like, what happens if we cannot access wood, sweetgrass, etc. How do we continue our basket making? I started to use vinyl flagging tape, and I actually brought the flagging tape onto the land, long strands of flagging tape, and did a durational performance where I braided the flagging tape for about an hour and a half. And so that performance, that bringing these synthetic materials onto the land and pushing my body in a way of like this kind of harvesting, but also this disconnection, and also a resistance and a resiliency in terms of an adaptation, but to push my body in that way to still harvest this flagging tape. It's almost like this kind of a contradiction, but I wanted to have that kind of a conversation. So this is one of my favorite baskets, actually, because it's very futuristic, and it was also very much rooted in me working with the material to actually activate like a muscle memory in my hands, and then deeper down into a genetic memory. So that's why I call these baskets the intergalactic Olnu basket, because in my narrative and in the story that I'm trying to tell, it was about the ancestors coming down and from the stars and showing us our ways of weaving and ways of making with these new and kind of synthetic and kind of weird materials. Like what can we create? I guess that's the story that I was trying to play out through creating these works.
Super. Hey, Meagan. So I wanted to pick up a little bit on that last point that you mentioned about genetic memory and how that's activated in your weaving, and just connect that to what Tania said about the basket being a vessel that kind of weaves together the past, the present, and the future. And also in Asinnajaq's film, there is a sequence of her grandmother making a basket, and that is actually a kind of like a transition into the animated sequence of the future. So it seems like in all of these references, baskets and the process of making them is really like a sort of portal that opens onto multiple sort of dimensions of time. So I was wondering if you could kind of like speak a little bit about your experience with that.
Sure. Okay, that's a big question, Laurie. Well, I'll begin by addressing the role of the hands in the creation of the work. No matter what materials we're working with, I believe every time that we sit down and we enter into a creative space, it's an opportunity to learn something new through processing a material through our hands. And like furthering into, continuing a creative process, that's when others come in to like help you out and show you the way. Like right now, I'm doing a lot more basketry, interweaving synthetics, but with ash and like with customary materials, because I've been able to learn more about material prep and like material harvesting. And then the way that the hands are interacting with these new materials, it changes, it deepens a relationship, right? So that's from the self. But if you think about it as well, like from, community perspectives, like these are the ways that knowledge is passed down, right? Through watching hands weave, through sitting together, through like going onto the land together, right? It becomes an embodied practice. And I think the embodiment actually of basket weaving and asserting oneself onto the land through gaining a deeper knowledge system is so important. And I think that idea, I was really struck by what Tania was saying around, each land-based work is a land claim. And like that resituating oneself in the land, like I think that's definitely been a really important process that I've been going through since moving back home to the island 4 years ago. I'm getting off topic, but all of it is woven into the basket, and I think all of our learning is woven into the basket. The basket is both teacher and vessel of futurity.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Oh, wait. Oh, sorry, 1 second. I just want to, I also mentioned in Asinnajaq's film, I watched her grandmother weaving, and oh my goodness, I thought that was just so beautiful. And I also just want to mention like the grandmothers and like the roles of the grandmothers as teachers and as transporters and as matriarchs. So.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, great. So Our final kind of participant for today is Wes Harman, who was not an artist in the exhibition in quite the same way. Wes was invited to create a response to the exhibition, kind of like the prompts of the exhibition and also the works in it, and to sort of offer another perspective on these topics alongside my own curatorial voice. And especially because I talk about in the essay, and some of these artists kind of touch on the topic of Indigenous futurism, we wanted to create some space for someone with an Indigenous perspective to kind of comment on this topic. And so just to introduce Wes briefly, Wes is Carrier-Witat, a nation amalgamated by the federal government under the Lake Babine Nation in central BC. And their multidisciplinary practice includes beading, illustration, text, poetry, and curation. And they use their practice as a way to interpret questions of identity and relation and prioritize the internal community dialogue, over colonial frameworks. So Wes, when you created this response to the exhibition, you chose to do that in the form of a zine, which if we had created like a printed brochure for a physical exhibition, that would have been sort of slipped into the brochure, the way that you might sort of accidentally find it and have it be like an interruption into the sort of architecture of the exhibition in a way. And you can access the zine on the website is in the form of a PDF. It includes images from movies and TV shows and some online articles, and then some really enigmatic images that are like the backside of maybe beading projects or something like that. And you, in your text, you really kind of like light the fire under what this provocation of futurity or Indigenous futurity or ecological futurity means for you as an artist and also as a member of Carrier-Witat Nation. So I wondered if you could just like talk about how you went about making the zine or what you were trying to express with it. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing me in on this panel, and also for inviting to do a response to the exhibition and in like such a open kind of way. I think we talked a little bit at the beginning about maybe doing an essay or something else, maybe a bit more conventional. But I'm like, it was really exciting to be able to approach this from a zine kind of background. So in my own practice, I do a lot of, one of my main projects is the Together Apart zine series, which is all Indigiqueer contributors. And quite often, I think we find ourselves kind of tasked with the, not problem, but like tasked with the, hard to avoid question of like, what is the future and what is the future for Indigenous people? But then like with the compounded identity of being queer and trans and non-binary, like it then becomes like, okay, and what is also the future for being queer and trans and non-binary? And it's just so many questions to have to kind of answer, and then to be kind of put into this framework of Indigenous futurisms, which I think a lot of both myself and my friends are, where like we really, really struggle with the term because there is an excitement to the term. And like, I think when I first heard it, I was really like jazzed about it and like was mostly thinking about science fiction and all these possibilities of technology and different types of storytelling and representation. But what it's now sort of become is a little more formalized and kind of increasingly difficult for me to engage with, especially with not just this last year, but just like everything also leading up to kind of what's happened in this last year of trying not to be demoralized by what you're seeing and still trying to hold some kind of hope for the future. But also, like, I think for myself, like that whole question is just like, I don't have an answer for the future personally, and I have less of an answer as we go, but being able to see an exhibition like this, where each artist can contribute without having to speak directly to it, felt really important. which is a really roundabout way to answer that question.
Yeah, that's great. Like I was thinking recently about the title and how it happened on the title, and that really came quite late in the process of curating the exhibition, but it sort of gave this like figure for me to hold the works together under, of like this idea of shimmer and the horizon, the futurity and everything. So for me, the work sort of became like their own kind of response to this prompt. And you talk in your zine a little bit about like the difference between hard and soft forms of world making and world building, and how softer forms of world building kind of like allow for this unresolved sort of ambivalent quality, which I thought was really interesting. And I wondered if that related to the way that you put the zine together. Some parts of it are redacted. Could you speak about that a little?
Yeah. So usually when I put together zines, I don't do it digitally. And so writing everything out by hand, you tend to make mistakes or kind of like go back and rethink something that you were doing. And I think there's something to be said about like the conversation that we're going to have here in this institutional platform with quite a lot of support in the background. But if we were to splinter off into separate little groups, I think each of us would have different types of conversations that just wouldn't make it into what is like the text and what is recorded. And so the redactions are kind of just me negotiating, trying to figure out the best way to say something and the most inclusive way to say something, while also trying to like not be overly vulnerable. I think at the beginning of the zine, I put a definition of what a perzine is specifically. So instead of just collecting like essays together and putting it into a zine, like this is very pointedly like me as an Indigenous person looking at this exhibition. And there are certain things that I just, would probably feel self-conscious about if I went on my went down the full path of a rant, either for or against futurism. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the redaction kind of signals at least that there's been some revision and some thought process, but also like some conscious withholding. So there's just like some stuff that doesn't get to be shared, like, but to also let your reader know that instead of just removing it is really an interesting tactic. And I just wanted to add as well, like it wasn't until after you had suggested creating a zine that I realized that zines were originally kind of developed as a sort of part of the science fiction community for people to share their own stories and sort of have those side conversations. So I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel back to the sort of sci-fi ideas in this exhibition. So I'd like to kind of open up the floor to everyone to contribute to this topic of like Indigenous futurism, or like how this term is problematic or like resonates with you. Like for my own part, I encountered this term at a conference for Indigenous futures that was put on at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and that's actually where I first encountered Asinnajaq's work, 3000, which was in an exhibition alongside the panels. And I was just like so excited by this version of futurity that wasn't just the kind of mainstream like apocalyptic sort of like this is how the future is going to be, get used to it narrative. So I just wondered what other people kind of like thought about these alternative types of futures and how that resonates. Did you want to start? Yeah,
I can say something. Yeah, I think that one of the most important things to me while thinking about the future is that I think like at a certain point, the future to me is really thought of as like, how will things look? What technologies will we use? And really focused on that kind of like image. Whereas I think how you make a future and what I'm concerned with bringing into the future through sharing with like my nieces and my family, it's about values. And however like people in the future use those values with like their wisdom and their intellect, that will be up to them. But what I can give them and what a future is built from is from values. That's what's important to me.
I think maybe I've been wanting to add just a comment around, like, it's really important to position also what influence Black futurism has had, and Black futurity within the idea of Indigenous futurisms, and to cite that and credit it, I think, is important. But also, I just wanted to posit that the history of Indigenous relations in Canada and the process of colonization was explicitly sort of set out as an extinction event, right? And the idea of salvage anthropology and the extinction of Indigenous peoples, which makes our futurity that much more salient, powerful. The idea of, Zvonar's idea of survivance, all these things are entangled with that idea of futurity that, many policies, including the Indian Act, are based on a kind of a phasing out, a kind of a limit, right? Whereas futurity can give this important contrast to that, to counter the kinds of extinction that have been that have been systematically applied to Indigenous people. And then the one other thing was, in thinking about Deborah Bird Rose's idea of shimmer, it's really important to also locate that she is talking about an Aboriginal concept and system and value, right? That comes from her experience working with those communities. And we tend to then start attributing, because she's written it down, we tend to start attributing that to that anthropologist or to her. And I can't speak to the whole text. I think she very purposefully teases out where that concept comes from. But I think it's in that way of relocating how we think through those knowledges and how we cite and look at that kind of lineage of development that is so critical to how we then also position the future, right? We're always working with the past and the present to kind of, as a mom now, like, I'm always trying to position things, for my children in the future, and everything I do in terms of moving home, them learning our language, is sort of built into, this hopefulness that is not naive to also the ongoing climate of colonization in Canada.
Yeah, thanks, Tania, for mentioning that about Deborah Bird Rose. It's like when you're trying to kind of quickly introduce a concept, the way that it's cited is really important. And one of the interesting things I found in that text, which apparently will become a book on shimmer, which I'm looking forward to reading, it is an Aboriginal concept from Australia, and she did most of her work in Australia. And she mentions how it's sort of available, or she thinks or feels like it's available for reciprocal capture. So that's sort of like an exchange of ideas where neither group is sort of forcing the other one to back down. So, I mean, that's not an unproblematic adoption of that idea. But it resonated with me in terms of thinking about sort of like how ancestral power and ecological relationships are combined. But yeah, thank you so much for acknowledging that point. Yeah. I'd like to maybe ask a question about archives, which I think actually Asinnajaq and Tania could also speak to, but I know Meagan as well, you have done archival research in your practice, and kind of like the ways that you have of approaching archives. Asinnajaq, in our prior conversation, you mentioned how you sort of needed to learn to listen to the archives so that you could hear what was actually there instead of sort of looking for what you wanted. And Tania, you mentioned as well the sort of embodied or intuitive aesthetic relationship to archives. So I wondered if you wanted to kind of expand on that a little bit, and then maybe how these kind of interactions are sort of like bringing that stuff out of archives and into the future.
I can start.
Yeah, please.
I always think, I mean, when approaching archives, the first step is getting in the door, like how do you get in, and like, I think for me, that's what took me the longest time, was, I could access some images online or, view things online, but to actually be able to go into the archives and receive like that permission to go into certain areas or lack thereof within other areas of the archives. That was the biggest challenge. And luckily I was able to do so. But and then when navigating the archives, I think like not so much with basketry, with other cultural belongings, it was actually really challenging. You know, it was a very difficult relationship, one that is definitely navigated through intuition. You know, as I believe Tania mentioned, it's a very intuitive process, and there was some belongings that I felt really comfortable to handle, and there was other belongings that I just knew not to touch. Like I really trusted those instincts. And I mean, I left the archives different than how I entered, if that makes sense. And then luckily, the next time I went into the archives, it was with community. So there was more of us who walked through those doors and went down into the vaults, and then it becomes ceremony, you know, and to sit with the belongings and to sit with ancestor artists and to leave that room with a new form of knowing and a remembering is something that then you begin to embody, you know, in small and humble ways throughout your life. But what then becomes extremely important is that those doors to the archives remain open, and that the group or the singular person that goes in, then it moves into a group, and then it moves into a larger community. And then we start talking about how are these belongings repatriated and where are they going? And, you know, like those, they're happening, and they're happening here in our communities, but it's just like, that's like the next steps. I don't know. So I don't like to think too much about it because it's so complex and it's so complicated. But there's so many gifts in the archives, and they're cultural belongings that are displaced. So they're always welcome. I believe they're welcome to visitors. Oh, that's it.
I'll just echo Meagan just in terms of that idea of visiting and, you know, asserting that our ancestors or people who deposited things in the archive, that they had agency and that they created those moments as an invitation to us. I echo that.
Thank you. Well, I think that for like a while, I was feeling pretty fiery and pretty strongly that a lot of the objects that are in these places like shouldn't be there and maybe should never have been there. But my dad really like, you know, brought me down a bit, and he reminded me that if those exchanges wouldn't have happened, and if some of these places didn't hold our objects, then we might never get to see them and would probably not have. So even though it's really complicated and there's a lot of mixed feelings, and maybe in the future it would be nice to see a kind of change and repatriations and so on, I do feel thankful that when we have access, that we do get to see things we might never have been able to.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just wanted to remind everybody that if they have questions, they can post them in the chat, and we'll be able to answer those shortly. I had a question about the aesthetics of Futurity, and maybe Elizabeth, you mentioned how you were interested in images of outer space and the sort of mystery that those images convey. And because of the source material that you're drawing from, there's also kind of sometimes like a tinge of nostalgia in the work that you do. But I wondered if you could comment a little bit about images that draw you towards them, or that have this kind of like sense of maybe like futurity, or even if it's just like nostalgic ideas about what the future would have been.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been thinking about a lot of the context my images come from are the 70s. It's 50 years ago. So it's a total paradox to be making images today of a future from yesterday's imagery. That was also a vision, a hopeful vision perhaps of what the future could become. So it is this weird paradox. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how. I feel like there's a lot of digital work, things on the internet that are seeing a future that is uber futuristic now, and I find that really fascinating. And it is just something we're making together collectively, a future. So I guess the aesthetics can be a mash of everything. So it's, who knows, like Metropolis from the 20s, that movie, that was a vision of the future. Anyway, does anybody else want to join in on this?
Yeah, I think it's a common thread through a lot of the works in this project, how it is, I'm kind of bringing them together under this lens of futurity, but there's often a very strong reference to the past, sort of like through relationships to place and land and ancestors and archives, but also like in Marina's work, like this reference to the deep, deep, deep geological past, this kind of deep time that is kind of invoked in the work through the material of bitumen, which is this substance that was made by critters dying on the seabed and being compacted over like millennia. So there's this kind of like long reaching backwards and forwards in time, and sort of, I think, hopefully shows the way that like the future is always kind of like predicated on the past. So it's interesting that you mentioned that kind of paradox of like using older imagery to create future imagery, but I think that's what's happening with a lot of the works. And maybe one of the keys to let us know that it's sort of, it has a futuristic tone is like the aesthetics of it. So like Meagan and Tania use really bright colors in their work, which also kind of references the synthetic materials that they're working with, but they have this kind of like this like sensation of futurity, I think. I don't know if you want to comment on that, either Tania or Meagan.
I can quickly. First of all, I love the aesthetics of bright colors. Something I'm very drawn to. And then like, I also like the juxtaposition, because I find like when I walk around home, it's either like all full of snow and like trees with the pink flag and tape marking the trails, or like tied on a fence, or a chain, like that chain link fence. And that's something that I've always seen in my environment, like ever since I was a kid. So when I started to weave and started to create artworks, and thinking about this interrelationship, you know, within the environment of industry, you know, within the landscape, and that complicated, very complicated relationship, I found that weaving the basket with synthetic materials was a way to be able to open a dialogue of what I was seeing in my environment, paired with being able to learn, you know, like I was also told it's easier to access plastics and things, like the natural materials are almost so precious that you just want to like test stuff out first until you can really get a good handle on the weaving technique and, you know, the design that you're going for. And once you build up that muscle memory and that relationship with the materials, you can start to move into, you know, the more precious materials, in my opinion. And it's a great practice, and it's a great like learning model, you know, something that can move forward for to contribute to futurity for the next generation of weavers who are interested in building that relationship, with materials and with language and with the land, right? Because ultimately that's a big goal, is transference.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are colors that come from a language of colonial extraction and also colonial development that is based on our displacement as Indigenous peoples from our land. So I'm drawn to them in that way and have used them in my work as a kind of maybe like working with them as a kind of remediation in a way. Objects of survey where we surveyed out spaces for our art conversations instead of a dam or a mine. I try to think about them in that way, in the sense of that kind of futurity. And also just the pop culture kind of reference. We often tend to picture the future in that kind of glittering kind of form or shimmer. And is the shimmer, I think that's the interesting part. Like, is that shimmer, is it a kind of a breath and an energy from natural systems, or is it a kind of a synthetic shimmer? There's maybe a binary in thinking through that, or what's the possibility of weaving them together. But and then just quickly, I was thinking about, Marina, your work and the worm and the view of the worm. And my son, one time I was asking him, we were having some kind of long conversation about like the origin of the universe. And he had come up with his own theory about like that things may have started through like worm waste. Anyway, it's just interesting from his child's mind that he had kind of also thought of worms. Anyway.
Please. You just have to unmute.
Yeah. Thank you. So inspiring. And I just wanted to pipe in with, I had a response to the idea of the future, and what I find really hopeful right now is that the future is happening. I started thinking about science fiction when the pandemic hit. I started thinking that we're entering science fiction mode, and I always future is happening like now. I'm so hopeful with the rise in Indigenous and Black and BIPOC voices, and I just feel so much hope in that. Not to put pressure on any of you, but I feel like that my world perspective has been expanding and wanting to. It just feels so right, And then just to respond to the synthetic. I've been doing a lot of research around color, and all the synthetic colors are the waste product of the coal tar industry, and it is coal tar, which was originally also part of this prehistoric breakdown of plants and animals, and so I think that and then also the fact that humans are always. Not that all humans are the same, but this imitation of nature. So the iridescence on the hummingbirds, right? As the inspiration for wanting to extend our palette beyond the organic, dyes that we were able to produce before, which would fade all the time. And so taking our cues from what's already exuberant out there, and unfortunately, going into extractivism to get to it. So the irony of wanting to be more like and compete with nature, and then in the process destroying it. So anyway, it's my 2 bits.
Yeah, I was thinking too, Marina, about like the way that you use materials and iron oxide and bitumen, and how these have like histories in painting, but they also kind of like have these links to sort of the material world. So it's like, it's not just a representation, like that material world is already physically imbricated into the work. Yeah. We have some questions from the audience, just a couple. If anybody else would like to pose one, please go ahead. Going back to kind of like earlier in our conversation, a question from Jackie Bordeaux. I think this was in relation to Tania and sort of Bush Gallery and making work on the land. And the question is, does this relate to what Leanne Simpson would call land as pedagogy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important citation for thinking through the work that I do, as is, just the work that my family and community and, has done in protecting and defending land. But yeah, absolutely. That's such a great reading. Leanne Simpson's Land as Pedagogy, and her also speaking to the idea of world building, I think is an important citation as well. Also, John Burroughs, who's an Anishinaabe legal scholar, I learned sort of posthumously of some of his work around citation, cite, S-I-T-E, and his use or his bringing into the idea of law Indigenous story and cultural narrative as a way of kind of looking holistically at stories as a kind of a model containing knowledge of ecology, containing principles of law and governance, and that's echoed by work in Secwepemc Nation by Dr. Marianne Ignace and Cookbee Ron Ignace from Skitchison, and their work looking at story, as also Joanne Archibald's work with decolonizing story as methodology, and many others, including scholars in my community. So those are all really important reference points for how I position the work I do now, the kind of a land rights aesthetic I think about.
Yeah, Wes, I was thinking in the zine, you really kind of highlight the ecological relationships that are sort of at stake when land is when ecological relationships are being disrupted. What is at stake? And it's like for you on your territory, it's the salmon, and elsewhere it might be the buffalo. And so preserving or supporting these ecological relationships, it's more than just a kind of natural ecological balance. I don't know if you want to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess when I was trying to put together the zine, I was trying to, again, solve that question of like, what do I imagine for the future? Is it optimistic? Is it nihilistic? And I constantly feel caught between the two. But when thinking specifically to my territory, the salmon being not just our food, it's like, it's a part of a relationship that we have with our land. And in our most ideal situation, like, I guess I would imagine the future of being like regularly being able to go home to help with the canning and the drying of our fish. Ancestor is the name of our village, and it directly translates to the place of dried fish, or the capital of dried fish, depending on if you're bragging. And trying to think about that relationship with salmon, and just that news article that I referenced in the zine of the buffalo being returned to their territory, like just watching that footage and trying to imagine kind of the same kind of return of our salmon run to our territory, like it would just be so overwhelming, because it's not just the food, it's like these are ancestors that are coming back. And in the last couple of years, especially, we have often had to make the decision about whether or not we were taking any fish at all. And we took some last year, but the year before we didn't. And part of this is due to like a relationship with not just Canadian fisheries, but with Alaskan fisheries as well, that tend to scoop a lot of the salmon that we use to survive. Not so much myself as someone who lives in an urban center now. But back home, like it's, a lot of people don't have a lot of money, and they really, really rely on that store of salmon for the winter. It's not just because we like to eat the salmon. It's like we literally, people's lives depend on it. I'm just trying to think if there's anything I need to add to that, and I think I'm done with that thought.
Well, I was wondering if it relates to the title of the zine, which is Cataclysms with the S in brackets. And maybe, I think this relates a little bit to Marina's work too, the idea of like multiple catastrophes happening over time, or I don't actually know what you were thinking when you gave it that title.
Yeah, I'm putting together some work for a show coming up about queer diaspora as well. And with a lot of queerness, it's like also trying to think of like, where is our place in the future, especially as, you know, I'm just turned 31, and that is not an age I ever thought I would get to. So kind of dealing with that the last couple of years of like, oh God, I didn't plan to be this old, which is not old at all. No. And the cataclysms part is, especially lately, it feels like there's just such a plethora of ways to imagine our deaths. And that's really such a heavy thing to contend with. And I think something that a lot of, especially trans folks and trans women in particular, have just had to think about our entire lives. And yet at the same time, like amidst these cataclysms, we're still here, which gives us hope to be there in the future as well. But yeah, it just feels like there's such a wide array of ways to imagine the end. And there is something really powerful in trying to be a little more contrarian to that and try to imagine the spaces in between.
Yeah, I think Tania in our longer conversation said it really just so perfectly, where it's like, I don't want to give more time to that vision. Like, I don't want to waste any more energy on that kind of dystopian vision. Yeah, that's it's super important. I just wanted to, we do have a question. Oh, a question from Lucas. Hi, Lucas. There's been some discussion around this idea of shimmer, though I'm curious to know more about how the panelists are thinking around the idea of the other word in the title of the exhibition, horizon. So just to kind of offer a little bit about what I was thinking in terms of how a horizon is sort of an embodied experience in a landscape that then becomes this sort of metaphor for a temporal experience, but it's really a kind of like a three-dimensional experience, and as you move around, your horizon moves with you. So I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that. Maybe Marina, you mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just had something very simple to say, which was around sunset and sunrise. And so I just also think of that kind of daily cycle and the relationships again through a less linear sense of time. And that maybe it can encompass both the idea of cataclysm and also the idea of, of rise outside of that. And so they're in a constant kind of cycle. I don't know, there's lots of stories also too, cultural narrative about like about night and day and that and how they are balanced out. But anyway, you were going to say to Marina.
Yeah, Marina, as you mentioned as well in the clip there about like with the invention of perspective, suddenly the point of perspective becomes the human perspective, and yeah, with the horizon and perspective, like how you might be troubling that a little bit in the work that you do.
Oh, well, yeah, the first thing that came to mind when the question was asked was, yeah, the history of perspective, but then also in painting, I mean, as soon as you put a line down, then it's automatically a landscape, you know, and there's already a figure in a ground, and there's already a separation too. So I think of the horizon as at once the potential for a separation to occur, which, you know, I mean, that's pretty abstract, but that is a separation between subject and object and a lot of power relations. But I've also been starting to write an essay and doing some research around the phenomenon of the Fata Morgana, which is a multiple mirage on the horizon. And there's a story that I found quite interesting of an Arctic expedition at the end of the 19th century. A couple of the explorers north had seen an island, and they marked it on their chart, and it never existed. It was a mirage on the horizon, and going to look for it. So I was thinking of that as a kind of reversal of possibilities, of being able to imagine new worlds at the horizon, I guess. Yeah, flipping it on its head, I guess. what is the mirage that we can see? I'm thinking a lot about Asinnajaq's animation sequences as well, and this kind of, you know, viewing from above and going into this alternate cityscape made of green energy, which I just love that. You know, I imagine that is a hopeful image for me of a place where people can live with ingenuity, but in harmony with that, with the green, with the ice, with the natural forces in the world. So that's my response.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about like images of space or images of like the nighttime horizon in Asinnajaq's film with the Northern Lights, and maybe the dissolving of a horizon in some of these, like with Elizabeth's works and also Asinnajaq's film. So did you want to comment on that, Asinnajaq, a little bit about, you mentioned in our interview about the sort of transition into the stars and into the sky and the way that you back away from the tiny speck of Earth?
Yeah, well, what I've been thinking about while we've been talking is when I made the film, I made it as a film, but also very intentionally as an installation. And as an installation, the way that it's made is like removing the credits. And when you remove the credits, it starts in a starry sky and ends in a starry sky, and it's a loop. And when the film plays that way as an installation in a loop, it's asking the question about what progress is and when have we arrived at the future. And it's kind of making the future become the past, and when it's cycling through that way. And that's what I've been thinking about now as we've been talking.
I think that is a perfect place to conclude today's amazing discussion, actually. So I just want to kind of offer my thanks to the artists for participating in the discussion today. Thanks as well to the team at Canada House and also my colleagues at the Ore Gallery for all of their help in making this project happen. The project was also supported by a grant from the BC Arts Council, so just to say thank you to them for that. Thanks as well to Collective Broadcast for all of the technical support today with the talk. And finally as well to Paula Booker and to Silvana D'Angelo for the design of the site and the editing of the videos. By the way, Paula Videos, Silvana website, thank you. But it's been just so incredible to work with everybody and this amazing team for this project. So thanks again to the viewers, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Laurie. Thanks for everything.
Thank you, Laurie, for bringing us all together.
Nice to talk with you all.